All right, hello everybody. Finally getting into the Lab 13 video. Let's go ahead and set this up. This will be a two-part video, just to make things a little bit more bite-sized. We'll focus on Lab 13 first, and then I'll make another video separate for development. But right now we'll just be looking at the reproductive organs. So let's go ahead and jump right into it. So for the most part, whenever I first kind of take a look at all these guys, I like to just get a basic definition of what they are, just so that moving forward I can reference these guys and you guys would be able to keep up with the conversation. So gametes are basically referring to the actual sex cells that undergo meiosis. You guys have heard of the difference between mitosis and meiosis already. Meiosis is just the division of that genetic material for the sex cells. The gonads are referred to as our primary sex organs. So primary sex organs and the gonads are what are going to be producing the actual viable substances with DNAs, like the actual cells with DNA. So for males, the actual primary sex organ, the one that's actually producing the spermatozoa, would be the testes. Um, and then for females, the female gonads would be the ovaries. So make sure that when we kind of get that definition straight, primary sex organs are just creating the gametes. Everything that is going to help with production, preservation, making sure everything's good. Those are all going to be considered secondary sex organs. So everything that helps transportation, everything that helps produce hormones, that's all going to be secondary sex organs. For sexual hormones, we've talked a little bit about this when we talked about the endocrine system. For males, we know about our androgens, which is the testosterone, and for females, we have estrogen and progesterone. A really good mnemonic that I remember reading about back when I was first studying anatomy for the difference between estrogen and progesterone during the menstrual cycle is that estrogen establishes. So estrogen is going to be the first kind of hormone in the uterus. It's going to like set up the uterus, like make it viable for carrying an embryo. But the progesterone, that's going to come later, and that's basically what's going to protect the uterus, make sure that it's kept up well. Sexual dimorphism, it's a pretty basic definition. It just means that when you look at a species, the male and female species of that are the male and female of that species look different just because of various secondary sex characteristics. Like for example, males have that Adam's apple, that laryngeal prominence that we've talked about during the respiratory examples. Um, if men look bigger or women look slimmer, that would also be like an example of sexual dimorphism. And this is kind of seen throughout the animal kingdom as well. So spermatozoa and oocyte, these are the essentially the gametes produced by our primary sex organs. The spermatozoa is just an immature form of sperm. So spermatozoa is going to be the first form that it takes. An oocyte is basically the immature version of the ovum. The ovum is actually a fertilized egg from the female, but an oocyte is like the unfertilized, still kind of developing egg. Fertilization just refers to the spermatozoa or the sperm and oocyte coming together to create the ovum or uh, zygote. So fertilization is just both of those gametes kind of coming together to form a new embryo. Eventually, we'll have an embryo. Embryo is essentially going to be viable for the first or essentially we'll be calling referencing the embryo as being alive for the first like 3 to 8 weeks, and then afterwards, like week 9 and continuing, it's known as a fetus. So let's keep going. All right, so male reproductive anatomy. So like I said, the testes are referenced as the actual primary male sex organs. This is where we're going to be producing that spermatozoa. The scrotum is just referring to essentially the sac that is carrying the testes, kind of encompassing it and protecting it. The epididymis. So the epididymis is this small little snail-like comma that sits on the back of the testes, where the sperm is going to gain motility, or the spermatozoa is going to gain motility, and also where it's going to be protected and basically kind of where it's going to stay until ejaculation. I'm going to be sure to point these out on the PowerPoint slide as well. I just want to make sure I'm getting the definitions out of the way. The ductus or vas deferens, this is actually what's going to be carrying the sperm from the epididymis um, all the way to the urethra to kind of expel the sperm. If you guys have ever heard of a vasectomy, this is actually a snipping of the ductus or vas deferens right over here. We also have a testicular artery and a testicular vein. Obviously, our testes are, an organ, so they're going to need their own blood supply coming in, going out. But what's interesting is that the pampiniform plexus is actually what contributes to our testicular vein. We don't just have a singular testicular vein, we have a bunch of smaller veins of known as a pampiniform plexus that is going to kind of wrap itself around the testicular artery. Now, the reason why this is occurring is because our arteries, our oxygenated blood is just a little bit warmer than the veins kind of coming back. So this kind of creates like a counterbalance, basically warming up the blood coming out of the testes and cooling the blood down as it enters the testes. Now, the reason why this temperature controlling is actually pretty important is also kind of related to why the testes exist outside of the body in the first place. So the testes actually hang outside of the human body. They're not inside the abdominal, wall at all. They're hanging outside of the body. The reason this is occurring is because the testes actually prefer an environment that's 2 to 4 degrees Celsius than um, lower than the rest of like no, lower than body temperature, because the spermatozoa when we're storing it, they actually like to be just a little bit colder. It's actually pretty cool because we can actually, we'll talk a little bit about how we can kind of control that temperature as well. But moving on, the spermatocord is just the fascia binding around the vas deferens, testicular artery, and testicular vein. So the spermatocord is just the fascia that kind of wraps everything up together. The inguinal canal is going to be where the spermatocord is actually passing through. So it's going to be an opening in the inguinal region that we'll take a look at. It's also going to be the site of inguinal hernias. If you guys have ever heard of a hernia, most common type of hernia is an inguinal hernia. We'll take a look at what that means too. Prostate gland, urethra, we'll cover the rest of these on the next few slides. So right here, testes, male gonads secrete male sex hormones. The actual portion of the testes that is creating the spermatozoa is the seminiferous tubules, which are tightly coiled tubules that are going to be producing the actual sperm. Now, there are a lot of other cells that we can kind of find in the testes. There's the interstitial cells of Leydig, which are actually producing testosterone. There's the Sertoli cells that are actually nourishing the spermatozoa, but the spermatozoa being produced is through the seminiferous tubules. And scrotum is just what encloses the testes. So here we can take a look. Right here is referring to the scrotum down here. The testes are these two ball-like structures on the left and right sides. The testes also have layers of fascia wrapping around them. So kind of like when we talked about the pericardium, we talked about a visceral and a parietal pericardium. So there's actually something similar occurring here. The testes are actually wrapped in what is known as the tunica albuginea. And on top of that, the tunica vaginalis is going to be even more superficial. So tunica albuginea is actually in contact with the testes itself. The tunica vaginalis is going to be the peritoneum, or like the outside protective layer coming up. Here we can see the pampiniform plexus that eventually contributes to the testicular vein. We have the testicular artery that comes down, and then that's the vas deferens that connects down to the epididymis. So let's keep on going. All right over here is the actual testes. You can see these seminiferous tubules are these small little lines, kind of parts right over here. Basically, the spermatozoa is going to be produced here, and then they're going to kind of slowly work their way into the lumen over here before entering the epididymis. Here's the head of the epididymis. Here's the picture of the cadaver. We have the epididymis that comes down, little tail-like structure, and then travels up into what is known as the vas deferens, and then going through the spermatocord. The actual anatomy of the spermatozoa is pretty straightforward. The headpiece is, excuse me, the headpiece is actually what's going to be keeping our DNA kind of locked in sound. That's going to be the part that's also penetrating the oocyte. The neck is just connecting the head down to the middle piece. The middle piece is going to be generating ATP. So obviously a spermatozoa, you guys have heard of them as swimmers before. That's the most common term. You probably heard of them. The middle piece is generating a lot of ATP because they need a lot of energy to travel up the uterus. And then finally the tail. The tail is just for motility, so they can kind of direct themselves. Epididymis, primary storage location of spermatozoa, protects and matures spermatozoa. We talked a little bit about that. Here's the epididymis again, seminiferous tubules all kind of coiling up, and this traveling up all the way down. Uh, we've talked about the spermatocord already, contents of the artery, the vein, nerves, lymphatic vessels. It's all passing what is known as the inguinal canal. So right here we can actually see what the inguinal canal is. It's going to be that small little opening that's kind of allowing everything to travel into the abdominal pelvic cavity right over there. And here we can kind of see a clinical correlation is the male inguinal hernia. So, like I said, we have that inguinal canal, something found only in the male anatomy. That inguinal canal is actually allowing for a potential space to be filled. So, whenever you're thinking of a potential space in a body, you always know, something could potentially go wrong there. So that inguinal canal can actually allow for part of our intestine to actually herniate through. So herniation is just referring to when a tissue is somewhere that it is not supposed to be. So because we have this spermatocord passing through the inguinal canal, we cause that weak point, and potentially our intestines can kind of just slip on through there. We'll go ahead and kind of skip this picture for now. It's just more cadaver stuff. All right, so accessory organs. These are the secondary sex organs of the male anatomy, and these are three different glands that we're going to kind of cover. The seminal gland, prostate gland, and bulbourethral gland. The bulbourethral gland is also referred to as Cowper's gland. Still, it's not as common. I usually hear the term bulbourethral over Cowper's. And each of these three guys actually have like their own unique job, what they do. So the seminal glands are seminal vesicles. What they're going to do is they're going to contribute a large volume to the spermatozoa. So they're going to kind of give it a lot of fluid. And that fluid is going to be filled up with glucose. So it's going to be allowing for our spermatozoa to take in that glucose and generate that ATP so that they have plenty of energy for their long voyage to come. The prostate gland is found a little bit deeper. The prostate gland is actually going to be a buffer gland. So the vaginal canal, the vaginal environment is naturally acidic with a very low pH. The reason for this is because it's actually preventing bacteria from trying to grow inside, kind of preventing infections. However, this low pH is very indiscriminatory, so it'll basically kill anything that tries to enter. So the prostate gland is going to basically provide an alkaline substance, which is going to raise the pH of the spermatozoa high enough so that it can survive that acidic environment. And then finally, the bulbourethral gland. So the bulbourethral gland is a bit unique to the male. Um, as you can tell, something that's different between male and female, males are actually sharing their urethral tract with their urinary bladder as well as their sex drive. So, and this is something that females just aren't exactly dealing with. They have two different canals instead. They have a urethra and then the vaginal canal. Males are actually sharing one tract. So, this bulbourethral gland is basically cleaning out any type of urine before the spermatozoa, or at that point, once they actually get all their glucose and they get their buffer, they're known as sperm. So the bulbourethral gland is just kind of clearing out any kind of urine from this tract for the sperm to travel instead. Um, okay, yeah, this is kind of explaining everything I just did, but I gave you a little bit of more specific of like why this is occurring. Um, Here we can see we also have a few different urethras for the male that we'll kind of talk about as well. Um, so here we can see the seminal vesicle. Um, Down here is actually the entire prostate gland. Oh, that's something else I wanted to mention is um, whenever, if you guys have ever heard of a prostate gland or like a prostate exam before, the reason why it's actually like common practice to insert a finger like through the anus back here is because the prostate gland right along here can be seen. It's literally such a small thin wall between the rectum and the prostate gland. So if you're a physician, you're able to stick a finger in. You can actually feel the prostate gland fairly easily, and you can actually feel for any kind of like lumps or any kind of potential cancerous material kind of growing there. All right, so for the urethra, used by urinary and reproductive systems, we have three different regions. We have the prostatic urethra, membranous, and spongy, also known as the penile urethra. So, easiest way to kind of break it up is to understand that the urethras are basically you get a new urethra name after each gland. So, after the seminal gland mixes with the ejaculatory duct, we have the prostatic urethra. Prostatic urethra is also easy to remember because it's in the prostate gland itself. As soon as we leave the prostate gland, though, we're going to become the membranous urethra. It doesn't look like it's labeled here. Let's see. Maybe it's on the next one. Okay, this works. Perfect. So prostatic urethra is in the prostate gland itself. Membranous urethra is after the prostate gland. And then after the bulbal urethral gland, we kind of have the spongy urethra. The spongy urethra is going to be the final location, essentially. Easy way to kind of remember the entire pathway of sperm that I found very helpful is to remember this mnemonic 7 up. So, um, I'm not going to type out the full word because PowerPoint does not want to work with me right now. So the S in 7 up is going to stand for the seminiferous tubules. That's basically where we're starting. The E is going to stand for the ejaculatory duct. So after the vas deferens, oh, I'm sorry. The first E is actually going to stand for epididymis. So we're starting in the testes and the seminiferous tubules, then we're going up the epididymis. Next up, the V is going to be for vas deferens, or the ductus deferens, traveling up. Next, we're going to be entering the ejaculatory duct. Here we can see the opening of the ejaculatory duct. Um, Luckily, N stands for nothing, so that's a pretty easy way to remember. The U is going to stand for urethra, but make sure that you guys are aware that there's a prostatic urethra, membranous, and then spongy, so make sure you know that order as well. And the P just stands for penis, essentially. So for the penis itself, the root is just the fixed portion that attaches the penis to the wall. It's pretty straightforward. You could think of like a root for a plant, like what keeps it attached. The body is just the actual movable portion. We have a few different types of muscles that we'll kind of talk about as well here. And then the glands is the most distal portion, all the way at the very tip, covered right underneath the prepuce. And the prepuce is also referred to as the foreskin. So here for the body of the penis, we can actually see the corpus sponginosum and corpora cavernosa. So corpus and corpora, those are just the plural and non-plural forms. The corpus sponginosum, this is actually going to be making up this entire portion right here. We can see it labeled. The corpus sponginosum is actually the smooth muscle tissue inside of the penis that allows us to control the diameter. Of the penis itself, so basically closing things off or opening it up. And then the corpus cavernosum, or the corpora cavernosa, whichever plural form you want. This is referred to as the erectile tissue. So when blood kind of enters the corpora cavernosa, this is what allows the penis to kind of stand to attention and allows it to be erect. So we kind of talked a little bit about everything here. As long as you guys are able to identify everything here, it'll be pretty straightforward. On the cadaver itself, there's actually not a whole lot we can actually point out, so I'll be sure to kind of go easy with you guys for identification in that regard. All right, let's keep moving. That's pretty much everything we just talked about. All right, so for female reproductive anatomy. We have the ovaries. The ovaries are going to be the primary sex organs. That's where we're going to be creating the oocytes. The mons pubis, that's just going to be um, a small pad of adipose tissue that we'll kind of point out as well. The vulva is just referring to the general, like, outside external genitalia for females. And there we'll kind of identify the labia majora, labia minora, the prepuce, and the clitoris as well. The vagina itself is referring to the canal that connects the uterus to the outside environment, to the vulva. Cervix is going to be a small portion connected to the vagina and the uterus. Oviducts, we'll get into a little bit more details about those guys as well. And we'll talk about these ligaments too. Um, All right, so let's get into identification. So, the ovarian ligament is going to be as it says. That's going to be the small ligament that's going to be connecting the ovary to the uterus itself. The suspensory ligament, that's actually where we're going to be finding our ovarian artery and veins. They're also known as the gonadal artery and vein. They're traveling through the suspensory ligament. That's what allows the uterus to be suspended in the pelvic cavity. And then finally, the broad ligament is just to give extra support to the uterus to make sure it doesn't prolapse or basically collapse onto itself. For the uterine tubes, here we can actually see, so this is the ovary connected to the uterine tube that travels down into the uterus. This is also known as the fallopian tube. The fallopian slash uterine tubes has three different segments: the infundibulum, the ampulla, and the isthmus. So, taking a look, the infundibulum, you can kind of think of the infundibulum as a catcher's mitt. So the ovary is going to produce an egg and it's going to discharge that egg. The infundibulum is then going to catch that egg, kind of like a catcher in baseball, something like that. Eventually, it's going to round around the corner, what is known as the ampulla. That's going to be the middle segment. So the actual rounding portion right over here is the ampulla. The ampulla is actually also going to be our site of fertilization. So that's actually something pretty clinically relevant, pretty important. The ampulla is the site of fertilization. So make sure you guys are aware of that. And then the isthmus is just basically carrying the rest of the egg down into the uterus. So here you can see the fimbriae is just referring to the actual little tentacles kind of hanging off of the infundibulum that's going to be catching the oocyte. Um, Something else to point out. Okay, we'll get to it. Um, okay, so cervix. Cervix is referring to the inferior portion of the uterus. That's going to be down here. So the cervix is going to contain what is known as an internal and external os of the uterus. Basically, it's just short for orifice. Those two guys are going to be found basically inside and connecting to the vaginal wall here, or vaginal canal. Now, the uterine wall has three different layers. It has a thick glandular layer of the endometrium. So, the endometrium is going to be the actual layer that's affected by estrogen and progesterone. That's going to be the part where the embryo is going to potentially basically attach onto the uterine wall is going to be at the endometrial layer, and that's going to be where development kind of occurs. The myometrium is the thick muscular layer, so these are actually pretty easy to remember because we've already done the heart before. When we talked about the heart layers, we talked about the endocardium, myocardium, pericardium. For this, endometrium, so metrium is just replaced with cardium. In this case, endo means within, myo means muscle, and peri means like a perimeter, like basically the serous membrane that is continuous at the peritoneal lining. So we talked about perimetrium, myometrium, endometrium, cervix, external os of the uterus. We'll keep on going. We'll kind of ignore this slide. Vagina, just the passageway that extends between the cervix and vestibule, right up of epithelium. Yep, that's all fine, fine and dandy. Um, Yeah, it's forming the vagina forms the inferior portion of the birth canal, receives spermatozoa during sexual intercourse, passageway for elimination of menstrual fluids during the menstrual cycle. And then here, I actually forgot to point out the mons pubis. The mons pubis is referring to this essential um, deposit of adipose tissue. This is a deposit of fat. So if we kind of think back to, what is the function of adipose tissue as a function of fat tissue? It's primarily as a cushion and to insulate. So during sexual intercourse, this mons pubis actually allows for a type of cushioning during sexual intercourse to make sure, nothing's getting hurt. For the external genitalia, the vulva is just referring to the entire area containing the female external genitalia. The vestibule is, sorry about that. Vestibule is just a central space bounded by the small folds of the labia minora. So labia refers to lips, minora refers to minor. So these are just the minor lips. These are covered with smooth and hairless skin. Urethra is also going to open up into the vestibule. So the vestibule is like kind of a conjunction for reproductive and urinary discharges. Anterior to vaginal entrance. The clitoris is a small protuberance in the vestibule. Um, Same embryonic structures as a penis. Basically, this is the erectile tissue. So, same thing when we saw the corpora cavernosum for the male penis. The clitoris is also kind of like that erectile tissue meant for sexual reproduction. It's going to be an extension of the labia minora and has its own prepuce. So it's also like a type of foreskin that kind of covers the clitoris. Talked about the mons pubis and labia majora. Those are both going to be the outer limits protecting the internal structures. So here we can see the labia minora here is basically setting the boundaries for the vestibule, the distance of it. The clitoris is going to be attached on top with the prepuce of the clitoris basically covering over the glands. Mons pubis is just the smooth adipose deposit that we talked about earlier. And then the labia majora is the referring to the actual like outer lips found on the outside. All right, so if we're taking a look at identification of these guys, I actually have a better slide to show you. Discard that. I'll actually show you guys right here. Um, let's see. Okay, let's go ahead and flip that real quick. So this is what actually we have in the classroom. So right along here, we can see that this is a snapshot of the ovary. So we have a few different locations that we're kind of paying attention to here. So as you can see, we have a like just a bunch of cells all located throughout here, right? You see those tiny little eggs? Those are all known as primordial follicles. Now, you have probably heard the term that when women are first born, they're born with all of the eggs throughout their lives. And this is actually true. We can actually see all of the eggs that this woman was born with. These are all the primordial follicles. Each one is going to be discharged a month until she kind of runs out. These primordial follicles are all a potential embryo or a potential child for once a month. We can see that as time goes on, we have these two guys right over here. These are known as primary follicles, so these have started to develop a little bit more. They're undergoing meiosis, so these guys are before meiosis. This is meiosis 1, where the female oocyte is kind of discharging a polar body. So basically, this guy is useless. He's a polar body. He's just kind of extra cytoplasm. This is the actual egg that's kind of being developed, that's kind of generating. As we move on, we then have a secondary oocyte. So the secondary oocyte, it's gotten a lot bigger, as you can see. It's grown significantly. And then as we continue on, we have the tertiary follicle or tertiary oocyte. Basically, we have this large polar body that's kind of existing right over here while still maintaining the actual egg itself. Now, at the tertiary follicle, when it's also known as the Graafian follicle, this is actually where the discharge is going to happen. So this is actually when the egg is going to leave outside of the ovary and kind of travel down that fallopian tube or that uterine tube that we kind of talked about before. And then this would just kind of be the leftovers of what happens afterwards. This actually generates what is known as the corpus luteum. So the corpus luteum is actually named because of its yellow-looking tissue. It's made up of a lot of cholesterol, and it's actually going to basically generate a lot of luteinizing hormone. And luteinizing hormone is primarily there because it is going to support the baby during birth or during the gestation period. Um, but if that doesn't happen, it forms into what is known as the corpus albicans. So these guys right here, which is basically scar tissue that hurts a lot. So that's not good. For males, the only thing that you have to really take a look at here is that right in here, the center portion is the lumen. This is where all these spermatozoa is going to be traveling, and then all of these guys located on the outsides. Um, I don't know why. I just chose like the worst way to make that circle. All these guys are just referring to these seminiferous tubules that are going to be producing the sperm to go down into the center of the lumen. And then here's the spermatozoa itself, so you can see the tail, the mid piece is like about right there, and then the head is like the final portion. And that completes the reproductive unit.